Gerald Knoss and dear participants, namaste and good afternoon. Welcome to the very special webinar of NICE on Ukraine, Russia, and the shadow of European imperialism. Before we start, let me briefly introduce NICE. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is an independent, apolitical, and non-partisan think tank which believes in freedom, democracy, and world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, conflicts are prevented or resolved, and peace is advocated. To talk on a very important topic of today, we have Gerald Knoss. Gerald is the founding chairman of European Stability Initiative, Berlin. In 2021, he received the Carlsten Award by the German Federal Academy for Security Policy. In 2020, he published the award-winning Spiegel bestseller, Welche Grenzen brauchen wir, which means What Borders Do We Need? In 2011, he wrote the book Can Intervention Work? With the British writer and politician Rory Stillwell. He is the founding member of the European Council on Foreign Relations and was for 5 years as Associate Fellow at the Carl Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard University's Kennedy School. After studying in Oxford, Brussels, and Bologna, he taught economics at the university in Ukraine and spent 10 years working for NGOs and international organizations in Bulgaria, Bosnia, and Kosovo, and has published extensively on migration, the rule of law in Europe, and refugee issues, as well as corruption. Mr. Knoss, once again, welcome to your program. Kindly make your remarks in 20-25 minutes, which will be followed by questions and answers. Mr. Knoss, over to you. Thank you. Please unmute yourself.
Hello. Can I use my slides? Do you know if I?
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic.
Please go ahead.
Okay, let me try that. If I'm still blocked. I think you need to. Just that I can.
Yeah. Can you start? Can you try now?
I try now. 1 second. No, I'm still. I think you need to make me a co-host temporarily.
There is some setting issue today, but let me try. Let me make you host, and you can do that.
Okay, let's see. Good. Okay, that seems to work. Again.
Yes, it's visible.
Okay, so you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Very good.
Yes.
Excellent. Well, thanks a lot. Well, thanks for this invitation. I am very happy to talk to you from Berlin. Just a little bit of background. I'm born in Austria, but I've lived in Berlin, Germany for a large part of the last years. Before that, I lived in the Balkans in Istanbul for 7 years. I was a Carnegie Fellow in Moscow, but also for many years lived in in Bulgaria and 1 year in Ukraine. So what I will present to you is a very short overview of some of the ways in which I think it is useful to think about the current conflict in Europe that might be useful and interesting to those who look from the outside at this continent. And let me start with the fact that we are actually at the moment war in Europe since the 1940s. There's been no war fought in Europe since the 40s, which has caused more casualties, more destruction, and also more refugees. If you look on global trends on forced displacement or refugees yesterday, which just came out, it actually shows that the largest number of increase in refugees and forced displacement in the last year, and indeed in recent years in Europe. More than 5 million Ukrainians fled to other European countries, just 5 million just to the European Union, actually, and were given protection. Forced displacement was, of course, or is a strategy in this war. We've seen it discussed on Russian television very openly. before the winter, the idea of some Russian strategists was to produce 20 million refugees from Ukraine. It didn't happen. Ukrainians managed to hold some of the biggest cities last year and over the winter. But already this is a movement of 12 million forcibly displaced inside and outside of Ukraine. At the same time, we've seen an increase in threats by the Kremlin, by Russia's leadership against other European countries. For example, Moldova, a small democracy next to Ukraine. There have been threats from Moscow that Moldova actually is part of the Russian imperial sphere. There have also been threats in late 2021 against other neighbors, Sweden and Finland, which prompted these two neutral European countries, and Sweden has been neutral for 200 years, to in turn seek to join the NATO, the North Atlantic Pact, the defense organization of the West. Now, Russian threats have not stopped, and of course, on Russian television, the pundits have kept threatening European nations. In fact, this has not stopped most of Europe to supply ever more, not just humanitarian aid, but also weapons to Ukraine. And Germany, which had a policy of supplying no weapons to Ukraine until 2022, has now begun to supply Ukraine with almost all the available military systems, including the most modern battle tanks for the Ukrainian army. So what is the future of peace in Europe at this moment of war? If we look back a little bit, and that's what I would like to do, at the European continent, what are we really seeing as a trend of the last 30 years going into the next 10 years? Let me start by saying that the end of the Cold War was a short moment of hope in Europe, that an era, a continent that had destroyed itself, as well as, of course, waging many imperial wars outside, but in the end, turning on itself all these different imperial powers, that in 1990, the Charter of Paris was signed by all the leaders of every nation in Europe, including at that time the Soviet Union, saying that there should be a democratic peace, that every country could choose its alliances, that there should be human rights and democracy everywhere. Europe is liberating itself from the past, was declared in 1990, a new era of democracy, peace, and unity. But this is where you see just the conflicts that are in the 90s. You had, of course, many armed conflicts in the Caucasus. You had one in Moldova, but then you had a lot of wars in the Balkans, in Southeast Europe, from 1991 to 1999. Now, you had wars, of course, around Europe, in Libya, in Syria, but you also had wars in Europe, the most recent one in the South Caucasus between Armenia and Azerbaijan, very bitter, very bloody. And of course, since 2014, fighting in Ukraine, this war has started in 2014, but it has vastly enlarged with the full-scale Russian invasion in February last. The strange thing, however, is that Europe has actually been divided since 1990, and indeed for longer before that. One half of the continent has seen no fighting, and this is, of course, Western Europe. In Western Europe, we've had not only peace, extending this through more and more enlargement. More countries wanted to join the European Union, so it grew from 12 countries in 1990 to 27 countries today. This enlargement coincided with economic development, and today a conflict, an armed conflict between the 27 countries of the European Union has become. We have a Europe in which in one half you've had a lot of wars in the last 30 years, but those countries that joined the European Union have been feeling secure and war seemed impossible. Now, war often seems impossible until it happens. I was traveling in 1990, then I was a student, but working as a tour guide through the Balkans, through former Yugoslavia, then two people said that there will be no conflict in Bosnia. I saw this mosque in Banja Luka, a town in Bosnia. I saw this bridge and traveled around the country. Everybody told me there would never be war, but there was. Yugoslavia had not been integrated into the European Union. It fell apart with bitter fighting that started in 1991, that continued in Bosnia in a war led by a group of Serb intellectuals that wanted to and believed that different ethnic groups needed to be separated by force. It led to the siege, the longest siege in the 20th century of a European capital, the siege of Sarajevo, that lasted 1,425 days. After the siege, actually at the very end of it, I moved to Sarajevo and lived there for 4 years. So I saw how the city then was rebuilt after the siege. In the 90s, intellectuals always have theories, and the theories were that these wars had to happen because there were different religions and ethnic groups living in the Balkans. Samuel Huntington, of course, had his famous and I find bizarre theory of the clash of civilizations, and the Chicago intellectual John Mersheimer explained how wars were inevitable with the end of the Cold War. In Bosnia, however, the genocide that took place in 1995 in Srebrenica brought a turning point. It brought an intervention, a shock first, and then an intervention by the United States and NATO in the summer of 95, which is well described in a book by the man who then led the peace negotiations, an American diplomat, which led to 1-year peacekeeping mission and a peace agreement. That peace agreement is still in force. And since 1995, there has been no more fighting in Bosnia. There was more fighting in Kosovo that led to another intervention and the question whether the wars in the Balkans will ever end. But again, since more than 20 years now, the Western Balkans, these countries of former Yugoslavia, have been peaceful. And one reason has been that there was a UN tribunal created for this specific war. Most of the leaders responsible in that war were charged, were brought to trial, including the leader of Serbia, Slobodan Milosevic, and the leader of the Bosnian Serbs, Radovan Karadzic, sentenced to life in prison for genocide. It was established that the idea of expelling people by force to create what was called ethnically pure states was in fact a war crime. In 1999, I was in Sarajevo then when leaders of the world, Western world, came together and promised to promote the integration of the Balkans in a continent without borders. That was the vision for peace in the future. So what we saw in the Balkans was an intervention that was very rare. Most interventions of the West in the world in recent decades have been disastrous failures. The intervention in the Balkans actually worked. So why was that? One reason was that it was possible to establish democracies, and that in Bosnia, for example, since the end of the war, you have had 9 national elections, changing governments at these elections, peaceful elections, which of course created a sense of predictability. You still have a diverse society in Bosnia with at least 3 big ethnic groups, Bosniak Muslims, Serbs, and Croats. Something worked, but the question is, will it last? The promise that brought peace to Europe was that any democracy, if it wants to and is ready for it, can join the European Union. With Bulgaria and Romania joining the European Union in 2007, here in yellow, the Balkans suddenly became an island surrounded by the EU. And the second promise was that if you join this European Union, you will become more prosperous. And this actually happened. So countries that were very poor 20 years ago, Estonia, Poland, Lithuania, Romania, saw an astonishing economic convergence. Very soon, Poland might be richer per capita, and Slovakia and the Czech Republic, than the United Kingdom. And yet armed conflict, which is unthinkable in Western Europe, is still thinkable in Eastern Europe and in the Balkans. We still have a lot of leaders that talk about war, media that talk about fears of war, all stories were including in the rhetoric of some of its leaders, Bosnia-Herzegovina. And then we have the wider context of Russia and the West that has, of course, been aggravated by the war in Ukraine, about which I'll talk in a second. So the scenario in the Balkans, there is peace right now. The question is if the ethnic diversity without integration into the Europe of peace, and the European Union in particular, which has not happened, might lead to backsliding, renewed conflict, and a situation of ethnic tension and violence. Now, it's important to remember that Western Europe, not that long ago, was also a continent in ruins. The pictures we see from Ukraine today, these were the pictures across all of Europe in 1946. This is how cities in Europe, Warsaw, Berlin, Naples, looked after the Second World War. Here, the city of Cologne in Germany, total destitution, 12 million German refugees, many more refugees from other countries in Germany at that time. At that time, the vision for peace was of a democratic peace presented by former British leader, then in opposition, Winston Churchill, in a speech in Zurich. And he said that the remedy to war on the continent was to recreate a European fabric, to bring all the countries together through common institutions. The first one was created in 1949, the Council of Europe, and it is telling that last year Russia was actually expelled from the Council of Europe, of which it had been a member for 25 years. The Council of Europe got itself a flag, which was then also taken by the European Union, and the Court for Human Rights, which is still there in France, the European Court of Human Rights. The idea was to make armed conflict unthinkable through integration. And the integration of coal and steel, and then the creation of an economic community between France and Germany, Italy, and the Benelux countries really worked to the extent that the European Economic Community of 6 became the European Union of 12, then 15, and then 27 members. And 10 more countries are right now wanting to join this European Union. The integration vision prevailed. But right now the question is, what does this mean for the war in Ukraine? As I've said, 12 million displaced in just 2 months. By now, it is many more. The response by the Ukrainian leadership to the beginning of the war, within a week or 2 weeks, apply for membership in the European Union, and then later last year in NATO. So the vision of the Ukrainian leadership is, if they defeat Russia, they too want to join the rest of the continent. And here you see the foreign minister, I just met him recently, of Moldova, also a country that applied to join the European Union in 2022. So the question of the future borders of a democratic Europe will really be determined by the war in Ukraine and by the response of the European Union. Will it allow the 10 countries that are now asking to join into the European Union? The European Union, which expanded by 10 members already once in 2004, by another 2 members in 2007, by another member from the Balkans in 2012, Croatia, and which gave candidate status in the middle of the war last year to the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. Now, Zelensky is saying that this is the top priority of his country. Of course, everything will depend on how the war ends, but the vision would be that if things work out by 2030, there will be a bloc of not just 27, but potentially 37, up to 37 democracies in Europe, linked together in an economic union with largely open borders, with cooperation and common institutions. Now, visions. In the 40s, the rival vision, one was that of Joseph Stalin, the communist vision. The other was that of fascist leaders like Franco in Spain. Even after the Second World War, until the 70s, there were fascist regimes in Europe, in Portugal, in Spain, and a military leadership for a few years in Greece. And then there were, of course, the visions of continued imperialism in Western Europe. Countries that focused on integration outside of Europe continued to fight colonial wars. And it was really the defeat in these colonial wars of the Netherlands in Indonesia, Congo, of the French in Indochina, where they were fighting until 1954, and of course the longest and bitterest war of the French in Algeria, which actually only ended in 1962. It was the defeat of these democracies in these imperial wars which created a framework within which integration in Europe was the only vision that they took forward, which actually worked. 1957, one European country was still fighting an imperialist war in another European country when the United Kingdom was trying to suppress an independence movement in Cyprus in what was then called a special operation with a lot of violence. So if we look at this recent history, you might say that what Russia is trying to do at the moment in Ukraine might be the last imperial war in Europe. It is an attempt to get back control of a territory that was once controlled by the Russian Tsars and then by Russian communist leaders. If Russia is defeated, might there be a similar turning away from imperial visions in Moscow towards integration? We do not know. But this is certainly the hope of other European democracies, that the vision of making war unthinkable among European countries in post-imperial nations, integrating themselves and focusing on economic development, this vision might eventually extend across the whole continent. At this moment, we are still very far from that. And I thank you for your attention and look forward to the debate.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Gerald Noss. Thank you so much for the interesting presentation. We have received lots of questions, and we are also running out of time. So let me share them without wasting much time. First is that what initiatives or strategies has the European Union put forward to promote peace and resolve the war between Ukraine and Russia? That's a question we have received from Sunil. And another question that, in your view, what role does economic interdependence play in relationship between Ukraine, Russia, and European countries? How do economic factors influence the balance of power and the potential of conflict or cooperation? Maybe you'd like to respond.
Yes, well, first, I mean, the proposals for peace in Ukraine, the consensus among European leaders in the European Union is that it's up to Ukraine to determine when is the moment for negotiations, and that the way to peace is to ensure that Russia does not occupy or acquire territory in Ukraine. So for the moment, the strategy is supporting Ukraine militarily. The Ukrainians, and I have just been talking to some politicians in Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, are absolutely determined. They say they had 8 years of war with Russia before, from 2014 to 2022. At that time, there were attempts to make a peace with some territory controlled by pro-Russian forces in the east of the country. This didn't work. But of course, we don't know whether the Ukrainian military will be able to push Russian forces out of Ukraine. But for the moment, unfortunately, it looks very much like this war will continue. The strategy of the Europeans is to support Ukraine, and the strategy of the Ukrainians is to fight until they have control of that. At the moment, Russia does not look like it is willing to withdraw its troops. Now, on the question of economic interdependence, that's very interesting, because until 2022, February, the beginning of the big invasion, Europe was very dependent. Some countries were very dependent on Russia for energy in particular. I mean, Germany, the country I'm in now, there was a debate in February, in March, that it was impossible for the German economy to do without Russian gas. It would have been a huge crisis to cut off Russian gas. Today, Germany is not importing any Russian gas, and there has been an economic cost, but so far, there has been nothing dramatic. Most European countries have cut almost all their economic links with Russia. So at the moment, there is a massive disintegration in economic relationships between Russia and the European Union. More and more integrated. Almost all of its trade now is with the European Union. It's been linked to the energy grid of the European Union. And it is clear that if Ukraine is to be rebuilt, it will need to become part of the single common market with the rest of Europe so that investors will feel confident. Also, don't underestimate that millions of Ukrainians have moved, especially women and children. Men are not allowed to leave Ukraine, they stay and fight. But women and children, 5 million, are in the European Union already now, mostly more than a year. And they create a very strong personal link between a lot of Europeans and Ukraine. This integration has increased economically, but also at the level of people, very much.
Thank you. Let me move to another set of two questions. How have other global powers, such as the United States and European Union, responded to Russia-Ukraine crisis in relation to its issue of imperialism? That is one. Do you see the pattern with respect to Russia's action first in Estonia, then Crimea and Georgia, and now in Ukraine? These are the two questions.
Yes. Well, I'm sometimes asked, and as I said, I lived in Ukraine. I also traveled to Russia a bit, and I was a fellow at Moscow. I was looking. I mean, I'm not a Russian expert, but I did meet a lot of people in Russia, and I'm sometimes asked how surprising this is, this war, or whether the leader of Russia has been irrational attacking Ukraine. And I think if you look at Europe's own history, recent history, it's not that surprising. I mean, European countries after World War II had not realized that the era of imperialism was over. They tried. I mean, the United Kingdom, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Portugal, all tried to keep control of colonies. And many of them, it was not that they suddenly decided colonialism was a thing of the past. It was that they were defeated in colonial wars, some of which were incredibly brutal. I mean, the French war in Algeria, or some of the British wars in Africa. It was defeat that changed their attitude towards imperialism. And from that perspective, in some way, what is happening with Russia, and I have a lot of Russian friends who see it this way, some of the Russians outside of Russia now, who hope for a change in Russia, they say if this regime is defeated, they hope that there will be the same change in thinking in the Russian elite, that you cannot win imperial wars, that the era for dominating other countries is over. But you're right, or the question has rightly implied, this is not the first such war. I mean, Russia has invaded Georgia in 2008. There are Russian troops stationed in Moldova, in Georgia. They are there by invitation in Armenia. They are also there in Azerbaijan. There are, of course, Russia annexed a part of Ukraine, the peninsula of Crimea. So what you actually see is Russia has tried with military strategy to keep control of these former colonies of Imperial Russia. If Russia is defeated in Ukraine, it might happen, and this would be probably the best case scenario, that a similar rethinking is happening in Moscow, just as there was in the 1950s and early 60s in Paris and Brussels and The Hague and London, that imperial wars simply cannot be fought and cannot be won. But for the moment, we're not there.
Thank you. Let me move to another set of two questions. What are the interests of European powers like France and Germany in mediating the Russia-Ukraine conflict? That is one. And second is how Russia's war on Ukraine has transformed transatlantic relations.
Well, Germany and France both were not prepared for this, and they were surprised. Until 2022, the major theory in Germany was that trading with Russia, buying Russian gas, selling, importing and exporting, would create interests and links that would be stable. There was a big surprise among many in Germany and in France that Russia would launch this big attack. There was not much surprise in some of the East European members of the European Union, the Baltic states, Poland. They have been warning for a while because in a way they are closer to Russia. They have themselves once been occupied. And it turns out that they were right. But now Germany and France, I think, have really changed their policy. And what we saw recently, there was just a big European summit in Moldova 2 weeks ago, where all the leaders of all the European nations, except Russia and Belarus, were there. And President Macron made a very strong statement, the French president, that France supported Ukraine fully. And as I've said, Germany is now supplying the most modern battle tanks, the most modern air defense systems to Ukraine. In this respect, they are now on the same position as the United States. It is interesting when it comes to the question of can Ukraine join NATO. Now, at the moment, there is a big debate because there will be a NATO summit. It is the United States that are the most reluctant among the big countries. I mean, what we are hearing from Washington is it's the US that says, you know, let's be careful, let's be slow. But when it comes to military support, the US has, of course, been supplying Ukraine with a lot of military support. So at this moment, this is not an issue that divides Europe from the US. It is a common vision of the conflict and of what needs to be done.
Thank you. Let me, we've got lots of questions on geopolitics, like we just mentioned about East European members. So there is a question that would Russia use its Middle Eastern allies against Western Europe? That is one. And second is, how has external actors and their geopolitical interest influenced or intensified the conflict between Russia and Ukraine? And there are lots of questions on the role of China. So I want to club them together. Where does it locate itself? Where does China locate itself in Russia-Ukraine crisis?
Well, it's very interesting. For a long time, there were hopes here in Berlin among the leaders that China could be a moderating force, that China could talk to the Russian leaders and help contain this conflict. German Chancellor Scholz traveled to Beijing during the beginning of the war, and there was this sense that perhaps China could, at the very least, warn Russia not to use weapons of mass destruction. Now, as you probably know, and as you follow, China has also made some proposals for mediation or for negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, but they have been very close to the Russian position. The Ukrainians have not rejected a role for China, but have not really responded very positively. And recently, I think there was the first conversation between the Ukrainian president and the Chinese leadership. I mean, that just took place recently. I mean, the hope among the Europeans is that China will not supply Russia with weapons and that it will manage to persuade Moscow that this war, it cannot win this war, just like the French could not win in Algeria, and that it's better to withdraw its troops. But for the moment, this has not happened, obviously. I mean, the Europeans look at China differently from the Americans. I mean, there was just a survey presented recently, which shows very clearly a vast majority of Europeans does not want to get drawn into a conflict with China. Majority of Europeans now thinks that Russia is a very real threat to their democracies.
Thank you so much. Now let me get with few more questions. We have received lots of questions, but we're running out of time. We hardly have 10 minutes. So let me take another set of two questions. What is the impact of Ukraine's geopolitical border between Europe and Russia's contributing to its complex relationship with both the Western and Eastern powers? That's one. And secondly, what are some potential long-term consequences of Russia-Ukraine conflict on the concept of national sovereignty and the resistance against imperialism in the region?
It's very interesting. Last year, President Putin made a number of very interesting public statements and speeches. And in one, he explained that in his view, there were only two kinds of countries in the world: empires or imperial powers, and colonies, dependencies. He really said that he doesn't believe in the sovereign equality of states. So you're either a power, by which he meant nuclear power, or you are basically a dependency of such a power. Now, this is a very familiar view from not so long ago among imperial European powers too. But in Europe today, the system that was created and that has brought peace now for decades to those who are part of the system has been based truly on the equality of states. So in the European Union, 27 members, they're all sharing sovereignty on some issues, but it's not an empire. As we saw with the United Kingdom, any country can leave the Union if it wants to. And they are all feeling secure. They are not balancing them against each other. There is no balance of power inside the European Union. So it's a third system of smaller countries coming together without. The European Union is not a power. It can't. There is not a single police that will execute, a European Union police to execute European Union or enforce European Union law. It's always the member states who do that. So it's not a power, but it is much closer integrated than any group of states anywhere else in the world. And so it provides an alternative for small countries to feel secure without losing their sovereignty. So they don't become dependencies, they don't become colonies, but they feel secure. And I think if Russia loses war and Ukraine joins the European Union as well, this model will be even stronger. So it's also from the geopolitics. If Russia loses this war, it's a strong sign that the era of imperial wars really is over. Even if you're a nuclear big power, you cannot win a war against a neighbor that is determined to defend its identity and its sovereignty.
Thank you. Since we have a little more time, let me put the last question for today. How does the Russia-Ukraine war impact developing or least developed countries in terms of food security and energy security, according to you?
Well, I think a lot of the world was surprised, including some Europeans, to discover how important Ukraine was for food security in the world. What a big agricultural power Ukraine is for especially some of the nations in the Middle East and North Africa. So a lot of diplomacy went into trying to allow Ukrainian agricultural exports to continue even during the war. As you know, some agreements have been mediated by the United Nations and by Turkey. So it is possible now for the Ukrainians to export some of their grain. But of course, the price of food has gone up. and the devastation of the war, the many, many mines which have been put in Ukraine. It's now heavily mined. What we saw recently, the blowing up a power dam, a hydro dam, and flooding a lot of agricultural land as well as some settlements. All of this makes it how much Ukraine is able to export agricultural products. And that is a big issue, not just for the Ukrainians and the Europeans, but for a lot of people in African and Middle Eastern countries. Energy, it's interesting to see the extent to which it was possible for Europeans for the moment to extricate themselves from a very strong dependency on Russian oil and especially gas imports. So this really has surprised some who said it wasn't possible, but countries that were very dependent on Russian energy imports have managed so far to do without them.
Thank you, Mr. Gerald Moss. Thank you very much for interesting discussion. We really learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience immensely benefited from it. We apologize to our participants for not accommodating all the questions due to time constraints. Maybe we can have Mr. Moss again in future, maybe in person in Kathmandu. Thank you so much and have a nice time. Good night.
Invitation and best wishes to everyone from Berlin.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.